Hey guys, it's Evan from Evan K Exotics. It's mid-February and I'm filming a video today talking about my feeding strategies when I'm breeding and pairing boa constrictors and the different subspecies and whatnot. So I think this is one of the questions I get a lot from my friend group that are breeding boas too. Maybe it's not like they don't have it's not like I have a lot more experience than a lot of these people, but I'm just getting a lot of questions because maybe I'm one or two steps ahead of a lot of you guys. So I just want to talk to you about my strategies and philosophies and understandings about feeding these snakes. And in terms of breeding snakes, feeding is one of the most important things you can do for them for a number of reasons. And one thing I want to talk about is the motivations behind breeding and why you are feeding when you're breeding animals and why you might be feeding them and the different motivations behind feeding them. Because one thing I'm hoping you're starting to pick up is I'm talking a lot more about behavior with my animals, and it's something that I think is a little bit underrepresented and underaddressed in the YouTube and social media realm. And I think that behavior with your animals is very important, but I also think in parallel to my animals, whenever I'm thinking about my animals and developing my collection, I'm also thinking about my own personal development in the hobby and my own parallel development as a better and more advanced and accomplished keeper. So feeding is a behavior that I do to my animals, and it can have different motivations or different functions or different purposes behind that. And when you're talking about breeding animals, I've identified three major purposes to feeding my animals that I'm going to be breeding. And those three things can be listed as: feeding is a nutritional input, meaning that it's calories that you put into your animals and your animals need calories. Two, feeding is a cycling pressure that you can put on your animals. The way you feed your animals and the way in which you deliver that food input can be a cycling pressure on your animals that can lead you towards reproduction. And three, it can be a formative assessment of where you are in the breeding process. So by their feeding behaviors, the animals' feeding behaviors, when I offer food, I can tell certain things about them. Or by the way they change physically after consuming food, I can tell certain things about them. So those are the three motivations behind feeding them. And then I want to break those down a little bit for you, and then I want to talk about how that goes down in real life in my collection. And so when we talk about inputs as a caloric input and feeding as a caloric input, this is the most rudimentary function we all know about. And it's probably the one that's where most people stop about thinking about the reasons why you feed your animals. They're like, it's because it needs to eat or it'll starve to death. And that's very true. And so the thing I will tell you about boa constrictors is that they are capital breeders, meaning that most of the caloric energy that they put into their animals is already inherent on their body before they start the reproductive cycle. So I actually don't know what the alternative term is. I think it's capital and investment breeding. I don't know, but capital means that they have most of the calories in place already, and they will shed a lot of that body condition and put that into the reproductive process. And they will consume relatively few calories during the process relative to how much that process takes. And that's contrasted with, I'll just call it investment breeding. I don't know if that's the exact term, but like humans are investment breeders, meaning that we have to continue investing calories into ourselves as the baby progresses and pregnancy progresses. So the point being is that you need to be putting enough calories into your animal to not only sustain life, but to encourage and sustain reproduction. An animal that is in meager ration mode is not going to have the calories to sustain reproduction. Similarly, even in like related features, if they are very, very underweight, they might not even reproduce because they're so underweight. So reproducing when you're underweight could be a risk because you can strip so much condition. And also, if they are so under condition, when you try to breed them, they might not even breed for you at all because their body senses the scarcity. But here is Bo. Bo is a Bolivian short-tailed boa, a boa constrictor amarali. And he is in breeding trials this year for the first time. And he's been going at it since October. And I've seen lots of courtship and lots of things with him. And the point being is, I don't know if you can see this, but he's pretty skinny right now. He's dropped a lot of condition. He was heavier at the beginning of this year than he was at right now. And he's still got several months more likely before he's gonna get the job done. And so if he did not have some condition on him already, it would be a problem. I will just tell you that people will talk about the female's condition a lot, but I also tell you don't discount the male's condition. I've always been a little shocked and surprised by how much energy the males put into this. And so I will just tell you that both your males and your females need a certain amount of condition to breed safely and successfully. The other thing I will tell you is that the way you deliver that food is a cycling pressure. So we talked about cold cycling, or back in the days they were talking about you had to cool your boas to get them to breed meat. And they said that there's this period of time right at the end of or right in the winter where you drop the temperatures, and then when you warm them back up, that's what induced breeding. And I think our understanding's evolved a little more like that, and to the point where we're creating seasonality with a lot of different factors. I've made a video called the 5 key controllable factors to breeding. Those are the 5 that you can use to create seasonal changes. But the big picture here is that when you're feeding your animals during the breeding process, your feeding should be heaviest and coincide with the summer, and lowest coinciding with the winter. And so it's an arc through the years, creating seasonality with feeding, one of the 5 different factors that you can control as a hopeful breeder. And so I will tell you that I do most of my feedings and my collections in the 4 warmest months of the year, and then I significantly slow down my feedings both in size and in frequency. And by doing that, I create another form of seasonality, of food, of calorie seasonality. And there's a lot of different ways you can do this. I know that some people just stop feeding their boas during the breeding season and whatnot, but I don't personally do that. I'll just tell you that I feed very, very, very heavily in the summer. It's ramping up in the spring to the summer, and then once I start pairing them, they naturally their feeding, the intensity of their feedings goes down naturally as the temperatures go down, and also as the breeding season progresses, it makes less and less sense to interrupt them for feedings and whatnot. And then there's periods of time, like right now, I'm probably only feeding my breeding pairs once a month. But what I'm doing is about once a month, I'm pulling them out, separating the male and the female, feeding them, letting them digest for a couple days, and then putting it back in. That's just how I do it. I used to keep them out for a week at a time, and I was still successful, so I don't think that it's like critical that you get them back in 24 hours or 48 hours or something like that. But more and more what I'm kind of just doing is I pull the male out. I have a rack with some spare slots. The heat's already on. I put the males in there with a water bowl. I feed the females in the breeding cage, leave them sit for 24 to 48 hours and put them back in. But I do that about once a month on my in the dead of winter, and that's about the lowest it goes, and relatively small feeding items. And I will just tell you that once I'm pretty sure that the female is gravid, and once I think I'm within like 2 months of the due date, I become much more conservative about feeding the females. This is just based on advice I've been told over time, is that if you feed a female, especially if you feed her too large of an item too close to the due date, it can cause problems. And I gotta tell you that in the past, I have fed a boa a pretty large meal, like a small rabbit, within a month of them delivering, and I got away with it. I don't know that it's something automatic, but I've just been advised to be a little more conservative about feeding your females as they get closer to delivering their babies. And I would tell you that once you're in the 2-month window, 60-day window, when you think they might be having babies, be a little more cautious about feeding them. And I would stop feeding at all if you're in like a month of it. It's just things I've heard and been told by people whose experiences I respect, making me believe it's not worth the risk. And the thing I will tell you is when she does have babies, that her metabolism will be phenomenal. She will be processing food very, very quickly. And so in that first few months after the breeding, you can really feed her more heavily as long as you're attending her temperatures. And I do it as a combination of frequency and slightly bigger than, rather than just like huge bombing meal. But you can feed a recently postpartum female boa constrictor pretty heavily after birth. So all that being said, the last reason that you want to feed your animals during the breeding process is as a formative assessment for where they are in the breeding process. And so by that I mean that a very, very enthusiastic, robust feeder, to me, does not say that it's moving towards the reproductive cycle as much as one that's got a little softness. And it's more about changes in the animal rather than like hard versus soft. Like if you have a female boa constrictor, it's pretty common for me. All my boa constrictors are pretty much ferocious feeders most of the year. And if you've had a female that's been with a male for a couple of months and she was slamming hard, and then this one time you offer her a meal, she gets super soft, or maybe she refuses that meal, or maybe you have to leave it overnight for her to eat it, that's a sign. That's telling you something that's going on in her body. And full caveat, I don't know. I don't have x-ray vision. I don't know what's going on inside their body, but I'll tell you that in my experience with boa constrictors, what you will see out of the female is some softness in feeding in the dead of winter, or in the dead of winter, or when you're starting to see like body changes that suggest follicular development. Well, as that gets more and more serious, I expect to see a little more softness in feeding, maybe even a possible refusal as you're starting to see that. And then as the breedings progress, you will start to see that feeding response comes back. Although I generally don't think it's quite as strong as it would be in a not currently actively breeding snake. But so if that makes sense, the arc of the female's feeding response during reproduction is it's pretty high when you first start, and once they've been with that male for a while, and that's starting to induce seasonally, or through the male's presence starting to induce follicular development, you'll start to see a softness in feeding that kind of valleys to significant softness probably about a month before the post-ovulation shed. I just looked back at my records, and that's kind of what I'm figuring out. And I'm going to infer something from a parallel of python breeding that I know, and the softness I've seen in python breeding. And I will tell you that I think that the softness in a boa constrictor is a sign that they are pretty significantly into follicular genesis, meaning the follicles are developing. But I don't actually think that is yet that they have ovulated. I think that once the boa constrictor starts to feed again, that's a sign that she's very close to, or is imminently, or has ovulated, is now in the true gravid pregnant stage. And the reason I think that's true is just because what I've seen is that in pythons, which egg development, oogenesis, and oviposition. So egg laying and oviposition are very parallel in pythons, is very in parallel to follicular genesis and ovulation in boas. So I'm inferring something from what I've seen in boas over to make this statement about, or something I've seen in pythons to make this statement about boas, so don't hold me to it. But if you start to see softness in a boa constrictor that is normally enthusiastic feeding and it's been paired, I think you're starting to see heavy follicular genesis. And then I think that what you're likely to see is an uptick in that feeding as it gets closer to ovulation, or maybe ovulation has happened, and then after that post-ovulation shed, you will start to see more feeding enthusiasm. Maybe not as hard as feeding response as they would before their pregnancy, but they do see it. You will see it more than you did at the lowest point. And where I infer from like feeding response on snake on pythons between ovogenesis and the pre-lay shed, and then when they go back on feed, even if they're maternally incubating after they've laid, I think that's in parallel to boas, if that makes sense to you. I hope that does. If not, put in the comments that I'm confusing you and I'll try to explain it again. But the point being is you can use that feeding as a assessment of where your snake is. And similarly, once your female has had babies, one of the things that I'm most anticipating afterwards is a couple days after she's had babies is feeding her. And what I really want to see is her have an enthusiastic feed response back, like return to old, her before she was breeding. And that's another assessment saying that I could pretty safely assume that everything went well. If she was still soft or reluctant to feed after she gave birth, I'd be more concerned that she was having complications. But that feeding afterwards, after she's given birth, is a strong sign that everything went well. So I hope that that's some food for thought on you about how I feed my boas when I'm trying to breed them, and the motivation behind it is both as a calorie input, making sure you have the right condition on your animals, make sure they don't lose too much condition as through the season. 2, it is a seasonal imposition on them. You can feed cycle them as part of your breeding cycling. And 3, you can use it to tell you where you are in the breeding process. So I hope that all makes sense to you. And yeah, I hope you have a wonderful day. Take care. Bye-bye.